My name is Rebecca Newkirk, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about trauma triggers. We're going to talk about how to identify if you have some, what it would feel like when you have one, and some things that you can do about it. So the first thing that we need to answer is, what is a trigger? What are we even talking about here, and what does it do? When we're talking about someone who has trauma, a lot of the time we're talking about someone who has re-experiencing, or who sometimes feels as though they're back in that traumatic experience, either physically, visually, emotionally, or even just physically. So that your body may feel the same way that it felt when you were in that trauma or in that traumatic time, or emotionally you may feel like you're back in that time, or you may even have like visual and auditory flashbacks, so that you like really go back into the memory and feel like it's happening again. A trigger would be an event, a sensory experience, or something that happens in your life now that triggers or activates that experience for you and makes you go back to the trauma. So as you can see, or as you can probably tell from the way that we're talking about it, it's incredibly unpleasant. It's really, really awful. And it's one of the ways that trauma insinuates itself into our day-to-day life years later. So one thing that you want to make sure that you are paying attention to if you're trying to figure out if you have trauma triggers is just noting that the trigger does not have to actually be very similar to the event. So a lot of the time people feel like, oh, like I was in, maybe a car accident, or there was an assault and there was a smell of a certain cologne, or there was like a really loud noise. Those things can absolutely be triggers. If you smell that cologne again, or if you like hear a really loud noise again, that can be a trigger, but sometimes it's much more attenuated than that. And so it can be really difficult to actually notice, like, oh man, like I think I'm getting triggered back to this traumatic experience that I had, or this traumatic time. It could be something that you didn't even really notice that was happening in the moment, but your brain remembers it and your brain made connections. And so you feel unsafe when that thing happens. So the first thing that I want to say about identifying whether or not you have trauma triggers and what those might be for you is recognizing that it's really more about your internal experience. So it's more about like, hey, I've noticed a pattern, like when something like this happens, I feel away, or when something like this happens, where it's this time of day, or I'm around these type of people, or, this thing gets said, or so I feel as though someone's demeaning me or putting me down. Then I start having all of this other stuff happen internally that doesn't necessarily make sense for the specific situation that I'm in. That's a really good indicator that your trauma has been triggered. It's really about the internal experience. One thing that I tell my clients all the time, and I think it's really helpful, is that a lot of the time, if you realize that your emotional response to something is disproportionate to what is actually happening, that does not mean you're crazy, and it doesn't mean that you're overreacting, and it doesn't mean, all that stuff, all that bad stuff that you might think about yourself. It doesn't mean any of that. What it probably means, or what it definitely might mean, is that you've been triggered back to an earlier experience or an earlier time that was at least somewhat traumatic for you. So that's, number one, the trigger does not necessarily have to be very specific or very tied to the event that was traumatic. And number two, what you're looking for is if your emotional response is incredibly disproportionate and it's very, very big, when, days or weeks later, you kind of look back and you're like, I don't know if that was really proportional to what was going on at the time, that's a really, really good sign that maybe your trauma was activated. So we've talked about what a trauma trigger is, right? It activates, it brings you back to an experience that was really traumatic or hard for you. We talked about a couple ways that you can identify if you have a trauma trigger, which is the disproportionate response. And we're really talking about internal responses. How does your body feel? How do you feel emotionally? More than we are about like, oh, I heard a loud boom and so it brought me back and that makes sense. It doesn't have to make sense. Your brain works in very mysterious ways, and it can make connections that don't really make sense to you. And all we really need to know for our purposes of healing and helping you move through it is how you're feeling. Like, what makes you feel that way? How can we help you feel better? That's the point, is we want to help you feel better. So we're really judging based on internal experiences, not necessarily whether something makes sense or if it really directly relates to the trauma that you had. Next, we want to talk about okay, I've like identified that yes, I have some trauma triggers. Maybe I've even spent some time figuring out what those are, and I kind of understand like it's this type of theme, or it's around this type of person, or it's when I have, I hear this sound or smell this thing or whatever. It could be anything. So maybe you've already done that work, and maybe you kind of have an idea of what might be a trigger for you. Now, what do you do about it? And this is always like this is the hard part, right? And I first want to say, as a caveat here, you can do preparation. We can talk about how to deal preemptively with triggers, because that's the best way to deal with it. You don't want to do it in the moment. And we can talk about why in a second, but we can talk about preparing preemptively and all that good stuff. Sometimes you're going to be able to know ahead of time that something's going to be a really difficult experience for you, or that you're walking into an environment that might be triggering for you. And those are great. We can do a lot of work with that. But there are always going to be times when you get surprised, that we're never going to be able to predict every single trigger. We're never going to be able to predict every single time that you get triggered. And sometimes it's going to catch you by surprise. So the work is two-pronged. It's if you know that you're going to get triggered, or that you're walking into a situation that might be triggering for you, which can be very difficult and scary and hard and all that stuff. We want to be able to do preemptive work, or like before you walk into this situation, let's talk about how to deal with it and how to support you in feeling as good as possible. But also we want to be talking about, okay, how do you recognize that you've been triggered as quickly as possible so that we can help you kind of come down. And obviously that's not ideal. If we do the preemptive work, a lot of the time it can feel a lot better. You can move through it a lot more easily. However, it's just part of, kind of the experience of living with post-traumatic stress disorder, that sometimes you're going to get triggered and you're not going to be able to see it coming. So we want to be able to do that work as well. So today, for the purposes of this video, I would really like to focus on what to do if you know that you're going into a situation that triggers you. If you know that you're going to, for instance, go into a crowded space, and crowded spaces are really difficult for you, or you know that it's going to be the 4th of July and the sound of the fireworks is really hard for you, or even if you're going to talk to a family member that you just have a hard time with, and that you get incensed every time you talk to them, and it's a really, really difficult relationship. It reminds you of when you were younger. It reminds you of what you weren't protected from, or experiences that you had to have, and it makes you feel that way again, which happens sometimes. Sometimes there are reasons that we end up having to talk to family members that we don't super want to talk to. So what to do in those instances, that's what I'd like to focus on. So the first thing that I think is really important, and that I think that is not done enough, is we have to give ourselves a lot of time before the thing, like a lot of prep time. We want to like emotionally kind of come to terms with it before the thing happens. What I notice a lot is that people, because they know that it's going to be really unpleasant for them, they kind of rush through it, and they like hold their breath, close their eyes, like white knuckle, and then they just like go and they try to get it done as fast as possible. What ends up happening is that the experience is really unpleasant because there was no preparation and they didn't have enough time to deal with it, and it ends up actually feeding the trauma and making it worse, and it reinforces the trigger, so that next time, even if you're going into a situation that might be a little bit easier for you, it still feels a lot harder, because just everything that's even related to it gets generalized and generalized and generalized, and it just feels super awful. And we don't want that to happen. So number one, give yourself lots and lots of prep time. If you think that it's going to take you, it should take about 30 minutes, give yourself like 2 or 3 hours. I mean like lots of prep time, and we'll talk about why in a second. This is part of why it's so important to give yourself so much time ahead of, sort of like in the beginning, preparation for moving into the situation that is going to be challenging for you. And I know this is really hard to do, but I want you to be monitoring internally how distressed you are. And it might be helpful for some people to actually do scaling, like on a scale of 1 to 10, like how upset am I? 10 is like horrible, I'm gonna have a panic attack and like pass out. And 1 is like, I could fall asleep, I'm so comfortable and relaxed right now. And if you get to like a 6, that's probably time to stop what you're doing. Seriously, stop what you're doing. Take some steps back and focus on calming back down. Now, this is well, I guess that's step 3. Let's talk about that in a second. But it's really, really important that you stop every time you realize that you're starting to get escalated, or every time something starts to feel really, really untenable for you. Because if you push through that, again, you're just adding to the trigger, you're adding to the traumatic aspect, and it's going to feel really awful, and you're going to have a harder time doing it next time. So number 3. What do I do in those times when I'm like, okay, yeah, Becca, I'm like at a 7, so I stopped. Cool. Now I'm just like sitting and being uncomfortable, and this is really awful too, and I'd rather just get it over with. Like, what am I supposed to do here? I hear you. I get it. This is the time when your coping skills are going to come in really handy. This is a sensory experience. This is the mindfulness again. I talk about the mindfulness all the time. This is when you give yourself a positive or pleasant sensory experience to lose yourself in. Let the thoughts come, acknowledge them, let them go, right? And instead be like zeroed in on whatever sensory experience you just gave yourself. It could be listening to a song that really calms you down. It could be deep breathing. It could be drinking a warm cup of tea. It could be smelling something that smells really good, whether it be like an oil or a candle or a food, whatever. The most important thing is that you are moving into your body, you're breathing into it, you're letting yourself be in this like really pleasant sensory experience for like 5 to 10 minutes, as long as it takes for you to be able to come back down. So there you have it, guys. I hope this was helpful for some people. This is something that I'm super passionate about. I have a lot to say about it. Obviously, I didn't go into everything that I have to say about it in just this video. If you have more questions about it, please leave those in the comments, and I'd be happy to answer more questions. I'd be happy to talk about it more, and I hope you're having a great week. Bye-bye.